She had poured coffee at that base canteen for 2 years, and nobody had asked her a single real question about herself. Then, on a gray Thursday morning, a sergeant said a dog's name out loud over his eggs, and the coffee pot stopped moving in her hand. 3 months, that's how long the K9 training yard had been calling him a failure. He wouldn't track, he wouldn't hold a bite. He froze mid-drill like his legs forgot how to work, and 11 trained professionals had written him off as a washout. What none of them knew was that a woman in a canteen apron had been waiting 2 years for someone to say his name, and when she finally heard it, she walked straight out the door, crossed a restricted training range, and gave a dog who hadn't obeyed a command in 3 months 2 fingers and a glissaper. Before we get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, and if you've ever waited years for one moment without telling a soul, this one's for you. Hit subscribe and stick around. The base canteen at Fort Calder opened at 5 in the morning, and Marin Colton had unlocked it every day for 2 years straight. She made the coffee before the first truck pulled in, wiped counters twice because once never felt finished, and had the trays laid out by 5:30 when the early shift filed through, half awake, boots still carrying yard dust. She knew every order by heart. Which mechanics wanted their eggs dry, which K9 handlers off overnight duty wanted quiet instead of conversation. In 2 years, not one person had asked Marin a real question about who she used to be. That was exactly how she'd built it. Small, manageable, no sharp edges for anyone to catch on. She had spent 9 years before that as a Navy combat medic, not the kind who rotated through a clinic with a name tag. She had been embedded, forward, attached to programs whose names she was still not legally permitted to say out loud. When it ended, there was no ceremony, no handshake, just a separation packet, a briefing about what she could never discuss, and a file sealed so completely that anyone who tried to look her up would find a woman who appeared on paper to have never worn a uniform at all. Her partner in that work hadn't been another medic. It had been a Belgian Malinois named Doss, and the man who trained him, Petty Officer Callum Reyes, 29, from a small town in Oregon, with a gift for turning bad days into something you could almost laugh about later. Doss wasn't a patrol dog or an explosives dog. He was conditioned for something rarer, built over nearly 1,000 hours. Find a downed operator, plant himself over that person, and refuse the entire world access until exactly the right hands arrived. It requires a dog with almost no interest in praise and enormous discipline instead. Doss had both. The trouble with a dog built to refuse the world access is that a medic is technically part of that world. On their second deployment, Reyes took a leg wound that looked worse than it was, and Doss planted himself over him and wouldn't let Marin within 8 feet. She had a tourniquet in one hand and a dog blocking the way, and Reyes, half laughing through the pain, said they needed to fix that before it killed him one day. So behind a supply container on a slow afternoon, they built a signal that meant exactly one thing to Doss and nothing else. 2 short notes on a whistle, then one long one. It meant, let her in, she's the one who fixes things. Doss learned it in 2 days and never once got it wrong again. She used that signal 4 times over 2 deployments. The 5th time was the last one. Reyes went down on ground Marin would never be cleared to describe, and it wasn't a leg wound this time. Doss was already over him before the dust settled, holding exactly the way 900 hours of training had shaped him to hold, while the man beneath him had already crossed somewhere her hands couldn't reach. She reached the edge of that ground, understood the shape of it in under a second, and whistled anyway. 2 short, 1 long. Doss stepped aside and let her in. She knelt and did everything she'd ever been trained to do for 11 minutes, with a dog standing guard over both of them, still holding a perimeter that no longer had a reason to exist. She left the Navy 14 months later. Not guilt exactly, though it wore guilt's clothes some mornings. The review cleared her, and most days she believed it. It was something harder to name. She'd built her working life around a man and a dog, and one was gone, and the other had disappeared into a transfer system she had no legal standing to ask about. Every request she filed came back stamped the same way, no releasable information. She filed 6 over 8 months, then stopped filing and started thinking differently. The canteen job at Fort Calder came open that spring, paying poorly, hours rough, and sitting directly across the road from a canine training complex that took in transfer dogs from sealed programs nationwide. Marin took it in under a day, understanding, in the plain way she understood most things now, that proximity was the only tool she had left. If a dog like Doss ever passed through a facility like this one, sooner or later somebody would say something about him over eggs at 6 in the morning. So she poured coffee, and for 2 years she listened to every word that crossed that counter, waiting for one name. For the last 3 months, the talk had circled the same washout, a Malinois from a program nobody would name, failing everything put in front of him. Wouldn't track, wouldn't hold a bite, froze mid-drill in open ground like he'd forgotten the exercise entirely. One handler swore he flinched at gunfire, which made no sense for clear operational conditioning. Another said he'd been caught pacing the kennel run at night, checking sight lines like he was clearing a building, then failing basic recalls the next morning as if none of that discipline existed in daylight. They called him a washout out loud, in front of him. Sergeant Priya Okafor kept defending him and kept getting laughed at for it. Marin listened to 12 straight weeks of it without looking up because dozens of Malinois moved through sealed program transfers every year, and she'd learned what hope costs when you spend it on the wrong dog. If you've ever made yourself stop hoping for something just so disappointment couldn't reach you first, you understand exactly the discipline it took her to keep pouring that coffee. Then, on a Thursday morning in October, Sergeant Okafor said the dog's name out loud for the first time, Doss. The word landed the way a name lands when you've been listening for it across roughly 700 mornings without letting yourself believe it would come. Marin's hand stopped on the pot. She stood there 2 full seconds, an angle Okafor would later say he noticed and thought nothing of. Then she set the pot down, said nothing, and reached back to untie her apron. Okafor was still talking about washout paperwork and a filing deadline. Another handler told him to let it go, that some dogs just come back wrong. Marin folded her apron once, laid it beside the register, and walked out through the door into the October morning without a word. The training complex sat 200 yards down the access road, gate propped open for the morning drill rotation. Marin walked toward it with the unhurried directness of someone who has known exactly where she was going for a very long time and is finally being allowed to go there. She crossed the road, passed the gate, and stepped onto the edge of the training yard in her blue canteen uniform, name tag still pinned to her chest, at 7:15 in the morning on a restricted range in front of 11 people who all turned to look at once. The yard held 4 handlers, 2 instructors, a kennel tech, and Commander Desmond Vaughn, who'd been at the fence line reviewing a washout evaluation 11 days into its process. It took him 4 seconds to register a civilian food service employee had walked onto his range without authorization. One instructor shouted for her to stop. She didn't. She was looking at the center of the yard, where a Belgian Malinois stood motionless 20 feet from a set of hurdles he'd refused for 12 straight weeks, exactly the frozen posture the handlers had described for 3 months. He was thinner than she remembered, a scar along his left flank she didn't recognize, something from somewhere in the 18 months her requests had come back empty. But it was Doss. She'd known it the second Okafor said his name, and standing 40 feet away now with 3 men closing in behind her, she knew it with the total certainty of someone recognizing something they helped build with their own hands. Someone caught her arm. She didn't pull away. She simply stopped where she was and put 2 fingers to her lips. The whistle cut across that yard the way it had cut across a dozen other places on 2 deployments. 2 short notes, then 1 long one, holding a full second and a half in the cold air. It wasn't a tone any handler there had been trained on. It was 2 people behind a shipping container in a country that officially didn't exist, working out a signal that had only ever meant one thing. Doss's head came up. If you've ever waited years for one single moment and had no way to explain to anyone why it mattered, put the words "never judge" in the comments right now, because what happened in the next 4 seconds is something 11 trained professionals watched and still couldn't fully explain afterward. The change wasn't gradual. His ears came forward. His weight shifted onto all four paws at once, and the unfocused look that had lived in his eyes for 3 months cleared out completely. The way fog clears off glass the instant a door opens. He turned toward the fence line and found her, not scanning, just finding, the way you find something whose location you already knew. Then he came across that yard at a dead run, past the hurdles he'd refused for 12 weeks, past two instructors who stepped back without meaning to, and stopped hard against Marin's legs, pressing his full weight there, and went still. The yard went silent all at once, the silence of professionals watching something no part of their training accounts for. The instructor holding her arm let go without deciding to. Okafor, who'd followed her from the canteen 10 seconds too late, stood with his mouth slightly open. Marin put a hand on Doss's neck, and he leaned into it and closed his eyes, and for a moment nobody did anything except watch. Commander Vaughn reached her about 8 seconds later. 52. 18 years running K-9 operations, and he'd never watched an unauthorized civilian walk onto his range and pull a failing asset out of a tailspin with a whistle he'd never heard. He asked who she was, not unkindly, the way a man asks when he has no framework and needs one. Marin straightened, kept her hand on Doss's neck, and gave him the only 4 words that were both true and hers to say. I was his medic. Vaughn asked the obvious follow-up, which unit, which program, which handler, and Marin understood she couldn't legally answer a single one. She gave him one name, Callum Reyes, the only piece she was permitted to hand over, since his death was a matter of record, even if everything around it wasn't. She said it plainly and stopped talking. Nothing else came, not because she was being difficult, but because there was nothing else that was hers to give away. Vaughn sent a runner to pull the file. It took 11 minutes, and in those minutes the yard settled into the uncomfortable configuration of people unsure whether they'd witnessed something remarkable or something they were supposed to report. Okafor stayed close, which Marin noticed and filed away. The person who stays close during the uncertain part is usually the one who matters later. The file came back with almost nothing usable. Callum Reyes existed on paper, birth date, rank, a date of death 18 months prior, location replaced by a control number. Everything else sealed, and when Vaughn ran Marin's name through every database his clearance touched, the result was worse than a locked door. It was an absence. No service record, no separation date, nothing anywhere indicating she'd ever worn a uniform. Vaughn wasn't cruel about it. He simply stated the position as it existed. A civilian with no verifiable history had entered a restricted range, produced an unfamiliar whistle, and gotten a response from a dog failing evaluations for 3 months. He couldn't build an official decision on that alone, and he was right to say so. One of the younger handlers, Priest, the loudest voice at Marin's counter for weeks, said what several were clearly thinking. Dogs respond to whistles. That's not proof of anything. A novel tone in a familiar setting produces exactly that kind of alert response, a coincidence dressed up as a miracle. Then Vaughn delivered the part that mattered more. Doss's washout paperwork had already been filed 11 days earlier, and it carried a deadline. One unexplained recall didn't undo a documented pattern of failure across 12 weeks. Unless something changed and fast, the dog leaning his full weight against Marin's legs would be pulled from the program and rehomed, or worse. He asked her to leave the range. She didn't argue. She'd spent 8 months arguing with paperwork after Reyes died and knew exactly how much good that had done. She knelt, put both hands on Doss's face, and said something too quietly for anyone else to catch. Then she walked back to the canteen, tied her apron on, and finished her shift like nothing had happened. Doss watched her the entire walk and didn't move until she disappeared through the door. If you've ever known something was true and had no way to prove it to the people who needed to hear it, put the words "I know the feeling" in the comments right now, because what Marin carried that morning was the complete explanation for everything that yard had been getting wrong for 3 months, and the one thing she didn't have was permission to say it. Sergeant Okafor found her at the counter at 4 that afternoon. 34, 9 years handling working dogs, 3 months of being laughed at for defending an animal everyone else had written off. He sat down, put both hands flat on the counter, and asked one plain question. What is he? Marin poured him a coffee he hadn't ordered and told him what she was allowed to. Doss wasn't a patrol dog or a detection dog. He'd almost certainly never been properly evaluated for either. He was a protective hold asset, conditioned to find a downed operator, position himself over them, face outward, and refuse the world access until exactly the right person arrived. Not until commanded down, until the correct person arrived. Okafor sat with that, then said the thing Marin had waited 3 months for someone to say. Doss froze in the middle of the yard mid-drill. Not at the start, not at the obstacle, in open ground, and the handlers marked it a failure and moved on. He wasn't failing, Marin said. He was holding. A dog conditioned for protective hold doesn't stop working because the operator he's meant to protect is gone. He stops having something to hold over. Put him in open ground with no context, and the conditioning still fires. He takes a position, faces outward, and waits. He'd been waiting in that yard for 12 weeks for somebody to come to him, and every person evaluating him had graded him on his failure to move. Okafor asked how she could prove any of that, with the deadline where it was and Priest already calling it coincidence. Marin said there was exactly one way, something that would leave no room for another explanation in front of everyone, and doing it meant putting Doss back into the precise scenario that had broken him. Okafor took it to Vaughn that evening. Vaughn said no twice before yes. What changed his mind wasn't the argument, it was the file. He'd gone back to Reyes's record and read it properly, and noticed the sealed operational history carried a canine handling specialty designation he'd only seen twice in 18 years. He knew exactly what protective hold meant. He'd simply never imagined it walking into his facility mislabeled as a failed patrol prospect. They ran it the next morning at 7, same yard, same people. Vaughn wanted witnesses. Marin asked for two things. Nobody signaled Doss, and she'd stand at the fence line, far enough back that no one could claim she'd cued him. Nobody was laughing that morning. Okafor walked to the middle of the yard, lay on his back on the concrete, and went still. No commands, no leash, no handler within 30 feet. Doss was released and given nothing, no signal, no name, just open ground and a man lying still 80 feet away. He was moving before the gate finished swinging, the low, fast, economical movement of an animal covering ground it had covered 1,000 times before, under conditions far worse. He reached Okafor in under 4 seconds, and what he did wasn't anything a patrol dog would do. No sniffing, no barking. He planted himself directly over Okafor's torso, turned his head outward, and stopped moving entirely, standing over him, between him and the entire rest of the world. One instructor, Foss, started walking toward them. He got to 15 feet before Doss's head tracked him. At 10 feet, Doss shifted his weight forward. No growl, just a small, unmistakable adjustment, putting more of himself between Foss and the man on the ground. Foss stopped at 8 feet, said afterward his legs had worked something out his brain was still catching up to. He backed off, hands visible, and Doss settled back into position. The yard was silent. Priest had both hands on the fence rail and wasn't saying a word about coincidences anymore. Then Marin whistled, 2 short, 1 long. Doss stepped off Okafor's torso cleanly, the exact motion of an animal executing the second half of something it had done before, and moved aside and waited. Access granted. The correct person had arrived. Marin walked out across the yard, past a dozen silent people, knelt beside Okafor, and put her hand on Doss's shoulder. Vaughn stopped the washout paperwork that same afternoon. What he'd just watched wasn't a dog failing evaluations. It was a specialist graded for 12 weeks on an exam written for an entirely different animal by people never told what they were actually looking at because the paperwork sat sealed behind a control number from a program that no longer existed to explain itself. If you've ever been judged for months by people who never once thought to ask what you were actually built for, put the words they never asked in the comments right now, because what happened in that yard wasn't a dog proving himself. It was a room full of professionals realizing they'd been asking the wrong question the entire time. Okafor found her afterward, sitting on the low wall outside the kennel building, with Doss stretched across her feet. He asked why she'd waited 2 full years, poured coffee for 700 mornings without saying a word about who she was. Marin told him that after Reyes died, she'd filed 6 formal requests, all stamped no releasable information, and after the 6th, she understood something clear about the shape of her situation. No proof, no standing, no legal right to explain either to anyone who might have helped. Some things, she said, you carry quietly, because carrying them loudly was never one of the options you were given. Vaughan made a phone call the following week, several levels above his own clearance, and whatever that conversation contained, it produced a result. It took 19 days. What came back wasn't a ceremony, it was a corrected service record, unsealed to the minimum necessary, and a letter confirming Marin's attachment to a joint program between specified dates, alongside a document confirming her role as attending medic to Petty Officer Callum Reyes on the date of his death. His name and hers on the same page officially for the first time in 18 months. She read it twice at her kitchen table and put it in a drawer because it had never really been about the paper. Doss was redesignated within the month with Okafor as his new handler and a training protocol Marin helped write from nothing because nobody at that facility had one, and nobody in the region did either. 6 weeks later, the base brought her on as a contracted consultant for transfer intake, looking at dogs from sealed programs with incomplete paperwork and working out what they'd actually been trained to do before somebody graded them on the wrong exam. In her first 4 months, she found two more dogs exactly like him. Neither had been failing either. She kept working mornings at the canteen a while, out of habit more than need. Priest apologized properly, twice, but the picture that stayed with everyone on that base was simpler than all of it. A woman crossing the yard at 7 in the morning without her apron on, and a Belgian Malinois who hadn't obeyed a single command in 3 months, rising to his feet before she'd even reached the gate every single day because the correct person had finally arrived, and he had never once actually stopped waiting for her. If this story reminded you that the person nobody thinks to ask a real question is sometimes the only one holding the whole answer, go ahead and subscribe and stay with us. We tell one of these every week, stories about the quiet ones who carried it alone and never once asked anyone to notice.